Saif Al-Adel is a former Egyptian colonel and explosives expert who is suspected to be the de facto leader of the Al-Qaeda group with the death of its former emir, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. It's believed that Saif al-Adel, which translates to Sword of Justice, is a pseudonym. His real name is Muhammad Salah al-Din Zaidan. He's born around 1960, the FBI claims, joined the Egyptian military around 1976, and became a colonel in the Special Forces as an explosives expert, possibly being trained in the Soviet Union. He fled Egypt in 1988 and reportedly made his way to Afghanistan, joining the relatively small but well-funded and mainly Egyptian Maktab al-Khidmat, which was the forerunner to Al-Qaeda. He became a trainer in explosives to new recruits who would stay in Afghanistan after the war to train members of the newly formed Taliban in Afghanistan. The leader of the Somali militant Islamist group Al-Shahab, Mokhtar al-Zubair, has once said that Saif al-Adel and Yusuf al-Ayir played an important role in the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu by providing training and participating in the battle directly under the guidance of two Al-Qaeda members and Egyptian former military officers, Ali Mohammed and Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri. Adel would later join bin Laden in Sudan in 1994. But that's not all. Several months before the 1998 embassy bombings, Saif al-Adel was helping Osama bin Laden move some of his followers from the Jalalabad compound Najim Jihad, to where it was the former home of bin Laden, to Tanak Farms, the former training camp near Kandahar in Afghanistan. The group had begrudgingly agreed to care for the troublesome Canadian 16-year-old Abdul Rahman Kadir, who was once a Guantanamo detainee and released in 2003 since his father was away and his mother couldn't control his drinking and violent outbursts. However, while they were in Kabul, bin Laden asked Adel to take Abdul Rahman to the bus station and send him back home to his family's house. At approximately the year 2000, Saif al-Adel was living in the Kart Parwan district of Kabul. On the local walkie-talkie communications in the city, he was identified as number one. On September 9, 2001, Saif al-Adel was approached by Faraz al-Abisi. Abisi himself was one of 9 British men who were held in extrajudicial detention at Guantanamo Bay. He was repatriated in 2005 and released by the British government. However, he said he was so impressed by the killing of Ahmed Shah Massoud that he wanted Saif al-Adel to volunteer for something similar. Saif al-Adel would write in his memoirs in November of 2001, quote, "The entire crew of the tank escaped. Shrapnel hit Khalid in the head, paralyzing the left side of his body. He recovered after 4 months, except for a slight effect in his left hand," end quote. In early 2001, the Taliban government announced they were bestowing official Afghan citizenship on Saif al-Adel, as well as Osama bin Laden, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Mohammed Atef, Sheikh Asim Abdul Rahman. During the American bombardment of Kandahar, Adel was present and witnessed the deaths of Abu Ali al-Yafi and his wife, Abu Usman al-Tizi, and his own wife and 2 children. On November 18th, Adel was working with Abu Muhammad al-Abaid, Abu al-Rahman al-Masri, and Abu Usama al-Fastini, all of whom were staying in the empty house with him at night. In the early morning hours of November 19th, he woke them up just minutes before the Al-Wafa charity building was bombed. Phoning friends in the area, he learned that Abdul Wahid had been killed in the explosion. He later learned that Asim al-Yamani from the Al-Farouk training camp and the elderly Abu Abed al-Rahman al-Abibi had run to the charity's headquarters and began rescuing survivors and pulling out the dead bodies. Most of Al-Qaeda was decimated in the attack, also known as Operation Jawbreaker. So where is Adel al-Saif? Saif Al-Adel. Well, since 2011, Saif Al-Adel has been connected with the kidnapping of the journalist Daniel Pearl and also connected to the 2003 Riyadh bombing. Adel has been on the FBI's list of most wanted terrorists since its inception in 2001. The State Department's Reward for Justice program is offering up to $10 million for information of his location. According to an article by Voice of America, the United States said Wednesday its assessment aligns with a United Nations report concluding that the new de facto head of the Al-Qaeda terror group, Saif Al-Adel, is based in Iran. From the State Department spokesman Ned Price told reporters during a daily briefing, quote, when it comes to his presence there, offering safe haven to Al-Qaeda is just another example of Iran's wide-ranging support for terrorism. Its destabilizing activities in the Middle East and beyond, end quote. The UN based its report on member state intelligence, concluding that the former Egyptian special officer had taken over leadership of Al-Qaeda following the July 2022 killing of its former leader, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, in an airstrike in Kabul, Afghanistan. But hold up. Wait a minute. In an article dated July 30th, 2009 by Time magazine, the United States had spurned Iran's offers to turn over even Osama bin Laden's son, Saad bin Laden. So what's the deal here? Well, according to the article, during the summer of 2002, after the U.S.-led coalition, 2003, after the U.S.-led coalition toppled Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, the Iranians came up with another offer. They would trade their Arab captives, including Saad bin Laden and members of the bin Laden family who had traveled to Iran to escape the bombardment in Afghanistan, and members of the Mech, an Iranian terrorist group that was given sanctuary by Saddam Hussein, in which, according to a Western intelligence official familiar with Iran's offer, it was a straightforward swap. Your terrorists for ours. The official says the offer included assurances that the Mech operatives would not be tortured and that international human rights organizations would have access to them. They said, we'll let the Red Cross or Amnesty International monitor the Mech prisoners, and we won't put them in some Guantanamo-like prison, said the Iranian official. But the Bush administration would have none of it. The Americans just couldn't bring themselves to trust the Iranians, even though they had been pretty straight in their dealings over Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, said the official. Instead, the U.S. decided to protect the Mech, even over the objections of Iraq's elected government. Iran's mission to the United Nations denied the United Nations and U.S. assessments in a tweet. Quote, it is worth noting that the address for the so-called newly appointed Al-Qaeda leader is incorrect. This misinformation could potentially hinder efforts to combat terrorism, end quote. So, where is Saif Al-Adel? Where is his location? And can we really trust the United Nations regarding information about Al-Qaeda being harbored in a country in which Al-Qaeda wishes to always attack and considered apostates, even after saying this from State Department official Colin Powell just before the invasion of Iraq at the United Nations Security Council?
I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. None of this should come as a surprise to any of us. Terrorism has been a tool used by Saddam for decades. Saddam was a supporter of terrorism long before these terrorist networks had a name. And this support continues. The nexus of poisons and terror is new. The nexus of Iraq and terror is old. The combination is lethal. With this track record, Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies. When we confront a regime that harbors ambitions for regional domination, hides weapons of mass destruction, and provides haven and active support for terrorists, we are not confronting the past. We are confronting the present. And unless we act, we are confronting an even more frightening future. My friends, this has been a long and a detailed presentation, and I thank you for your patience, but there is one more subject that I would like to touch on briefly, and it should be a subject of deep and continuing concern to this Council: Saddam Hussein's violations of human rights. Underlying all that I have said, underlying all the facts and the patterns of behavior that I have identified, is Saddam Hussein's contempt for the will of this Council, his contempt for the truth, and most damning of all, his utter contempt for human life. Saddam Hussein's use of mustard and nerve gas against the Kurds in 1988 was one of the 20th century's most horrible atrocities. 5,000 men, women, and children died. His campaign against the Kurds from 1987 to 89 included mass summary executions, disappearances, arbitrary jailing, ethnic cleansing, and the destruction of some 2,000 villages. He has also conducted ethnic cleansing against the Shia Iraqis and the Marsh Arabs, whose culture has flourished for more than a millennium. Saddam Hussein's police state ruthlessly eliminates anyone who dares to dissent. Iraq has more forced disappearance cases than any other country. Tens of thousands of people were reported missing in the past decade. Nothing points more clearly to Saddam Hussein's dangerous intentions and the threat he poses to all of us than his calculated cruelty to his own citizens and to his neighbors. Clearly, Saddam Hussein and his regime will stop at nothing until something stops him. For more than 20 years, by word and by deed, Saddam Hussein has pursued his ambition to dominate Iraq and the broader Middle East using the only means he knows: intimidation, coercion, and annihilation of all those who might stand in his way. For Saddam Hussein, possession of the world's most deadly weapons is the ultimate trump card, the one he must hold to fulfill his ambition. We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more. Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his grandiose plans, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons at a time and a place and in a manner of his choosing, at a time when the world is in a much weaker position to respond? The United States will not and cannot run that risk to the American people. Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option, not in a post-September 11th world. My colleagues, over 3 months ago, this Council recognized that Iraq continued to pose a threat to international peace and security, and that Iraq had been and remained in material breach of its disarmament obligations. Today, Iraq still poses a threat, and Iraq still remains in material breach. Indeed, by its failure to seize on its one last opportunity to come clean and disarm, Iraq has put itself in deeper material breach and closer to the day when it will face serious consequences for its continued defiance of this Council. My colleagues, we have an obligation to our citizens. We have an obligation to this body to see that our resolutions are complied with. We wrote 1441 not in order to go to war. We wrote 1441 to try to preserve the peace. We wrote 1441 to give Iraq one last chance. Iraq is not so far taking that one last chance. We must not shrink from whatever is ahead of us. We must not fail in our duty and our responsibility to the citizens of the countries that are represented by this body.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.